So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Guerra. This is the session of the State of Digital Rights and Free Expression Online in the USA. We're just going to wait for about a minute for everyone to kind of settle. In the meantime, what I'll do is just tell you a little bit about the idea in terms of how I'm going to be organizing this. It's really meant to be an interactive conversation, which I'll get into kind of what that means. I ask all of you that are in the audience, if you've looked at the program, if you have any questions related to the topic, to please start formulating that now. I want you all to be engaged. So without any further ado, I'll restart. My name is Robert Guerra. I'm the founder and CEO of Privaterra, and have long worked in the field of free expression online through a variety of different roles and different organizations, and worked in the kind of digital security space for about 10, 15 years, and have seen kind of the issue of kind of digital security and support for free expression in different countries recede, and be at a standstill. And thought it would be a good idea, with all the conversations that are taking place in regards to internet freedom and online rights, to sit back and reflect and invite some experts on a panel, and hopefully have a conversation with the audience in the room on the situation in the U.S. What do folks that have experience in dealing with different stakeholder groups, whether it's from a government perspective, whether it's from an operator of kind of the infrastructure or companies, folks that work with the accused and lawyers generally, and government officials, what are the issues that they've had to deal with? What for them is kind of human rights online in the U.S.? What are some different aspects of that issue, whether it's access to the technology, broadband, protections to promote not only free expression but freedom of association, and other rights that we have, and how that relates to the online space, and kind of other challenges, and how both this administration and the government more generally have done to support that or have thwarted efforts. And so that's the interest, to kind of unbundle all that and have a conversation about it. The idea for the format is to have me make a set of some comments in terms of the framing. I'll talk about kind of the way I want to have the agenda for the conversation, which is that I'll ask all the panelists up front I'll ask them a question so they can give their perspective on the question. They can ask each other a question, and then I'll ask all of you if you have any comments that you want to make on comments the experts have made up front, if you have any questions, and have really a conversation with all of you. So if you're coming from a perspective that you know the situation in the US, or you're curious, or whether you know how the situation here might relate to abroad, to please make that. And then I'll ask the panel another set of questions and go back to the audience. So it's really to have a conversation with the panel and the audience as well. In the program, which you may have, I have invited a set of experts to the panel. I'll say who they are. To my immediate right is Jumana Musa, who's with the National Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys; Kevin Bankston, who's the director of New America's Open Technology Institute; Harvey Rishikof, who's with the American Bar Association and senior counsel at Crowell and Mooring; and Dawson, who's president of web hosting provider Servint, and also the chairman and co-founder of the Internet Infrastructure Coalition. And so the question I'll ask all the panel is, over the last year, in your perspective, and then we'll drill down, has the situation of human rights online gotten better, gotten worse, or about the same? So I'll start with you, Kevin.
Sure. Approaching it from the perspective of in the USA, 2013, 2014 was a pretty dark season when we, thanks to Edward Snowden, found out the exact width and breadth of the NSA's surveillance activities, both its bulk collection of telephone records here in the United States, its surveillance under a law called the FISA Amendments Act, Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, which includes both sitting on top of the fiber and filtering through all of it for targets, as well as making mass requests to providers under a program called PRISM, and then its activities under executive order, mostly outside of the country, doing very similar things, but in ways that implicate the privacy of Americans. However, in the past year, well, most of the revelations came in the first year. So in the past year, we haven't had as many huge, awful, scary revelations about what the NSA is doing. In the meantime, though, we have had several very positive developments, such that I would say this year has been better for human rights in the US than the previous year. First off, a big step for everyone's access to an unfiltered open internet was the FCC's issuance of an open internet rule to enforce net neutrality, not just at the last mile to your home, as did the last rule that got struck down, but also at the interconnection points where the providers hand over data between each other, where we've seen some filtering and blocking happening to interfere with Netflix, amongst other things, and also net neutrality for wireless providers as well as wired providers. And so we see this as a very positive step for access to a free and open internet. And on the surveillance tip, in June, we saw passage of the USA Freedom Act, which was a first step in terms of reforming the NSA's surveillance authorities. It ended, or rather began the transition toward ending, it will be phased out by the end of the year, the NSA's bulk collection of phone records, and essentially banned the indiscriminate bulk collection of any type of record under several intelligence authorities, while adding a range of new transparency and accountability mechanisms into US surveillance. It didn't do everything. It's only a first step. It barely touched the 702 and 12333 surveillance I mentioned, except to the extent that it allowed companies to report more information about how they're responding to the legal process, which reflects another very positive step, which is we've seen an enormous explosion post-Snowden in companies publishing much more detailed information, both about the requests they receive from the government in regard to handing over personal data, but also requests from the government or governments around the world for taking down or blocking content. So all in all, two very positive steps toward protecting human rights and access to a free and open internet. That doesn't mean we're done. There's a lot more work to be done on surveillance. On net neutrality, we still need to protect the rule in Congress and in the courts. There are some troublesome, and we can talk more about them. Jumana, I expect, has some comments on them. Some troublesome cybersecurity and computer crime proposals brewing in Congress, and perhaps most notably for this audience and for the audience in the discussion down the hall, is the US government's proposals around encryption and its concern that it needs access to unencrypted data in ways that many in our community are concerned would harm security and human rights overall. A perspective perhaps best reflected for this community by David Kaye, Special Rapporteur to the UN, who recently published a report on the importance of encryption to human rights and anonymity online.
So Jumana, from your perspective, if you tell us a little bit of kind of what your organization does, because I think you're a newcomer to the IGF-USA, have things gotten better, worse, or stayed the same?
I think my answer is they've gotten better and worse. It depends sort of where you're looking. So just to give sort of our perspective on this, which is somewhat different. It's not just sort of the general openness of the internet or even just a First Amendment issue, which obviously we do care about the First Amendment. But what we're really focused on is how this affects enforcement and ultimately the government's ability to take the ultimate sanction, which is to either incarcerate someone or even put them to death, right? How does it affect people's fair trial rights? How does it affect the way in which people are investigated, arrested, and prosecuted? And so in that context, I think, and in my perspective, I've never called myself a tech person. I'm not a tech person. I'm a human rights person. And I think the U.S. government has always been very outward-looking when they look at human rights violations and criticizing, how human rights are treated. and tends to then promote their own programs, which also violate human rights, as necessary, especially for national security. And I think that's the critical piece, is this discussion always happens in the context of national security and highly emotional cases. ISIL is, or ISIS or IS or whatever they're called today, is, making threats. They're recruiting people in the United States. We have to have a countering violent extremism measure. We have to, be able to look at everybody's information online. We have to be able to do this to disrupt plots. Realistically, what we have found as an association of criminal defense lawyers is that certainly they use these things in national security cases. It's not that they don't. But where they're showing up much more frequently is in drug cases, in gang cases, in white-collar cases. And so it is always the case, and has always been the case in the United States, that these programs that get rolled out in the context of national security end up really infiltrating the entire system. It never stays encapsulated. It never stays in one place. I would also just put out there that even if it is a national security case, even if someone is accused of terrorism-related crimes, that doesn't mean they should have lesser fair trial rights. Okay, that's not the way our system is supposed to be set up. And so I think the way I approach it is this. I think right now we've seen, and there's been a lot of discussion with the president commuting some sentences recently, making speeches about mass incarceration in the entire system. We're sort of at this point in what was launched as the drug war, where we've seen all the problems that have come with that, with people at over-incarceration of the population, with people being deprived of their rights once they're out of prison, how that affects society, how that affects community, everything from the ability to vote to just people's ability to get housing, education. So that conversation is very live right now. And I think what's less live and what we see as sort of that next frontier is how the way in which the United States collects, stores, and data mines information and uses it in the context of criminal cases is going to affect this next round of how people are prosecuted, how people are charged, and how people go to jail. So I think from my perspective, we're sort of, if I were to compare the two, we're sort of at the beginning where we're launching a drug war versus, at the tail end of all the disastrous consequences. And so I think just to hit on a couple of things in the context of all of this is, yes, there's been some positive reforms this year. We've even seen some positive court cases in terms of the ability of law enforcement to search your electronic records, to search your devices, right? So if I get pulled over, can they look through my phone and look at all my email and look at all my documents? There are courts that have said, no, that's not an acceptable search incident to an arrest. That's a positive. At the same time, we've seen a court case that said, can they track me with my telephone? Yes, because they're relying on case law from the 1970s that, would liken it to my phone records or my sharing information with a third party. Like I went to the bank and I gave them bank deposits, so I knew they would have the information, so it's not private. So the privacy of your documents are very much in question, and this ties in very closely to criminal prosecutions in terms of what they can access, what they can search, and what is the standard they need to get it. I think the other thing we've seen, and where we feel some of these reforms have really fallen short, is that they may be collecting information through some of the programs that Kevin mentioned, like the 702 program or the 215 program, but that doesn't mean they necessarily tell people that when they prosecute them. They have this other thing it's called parallel construction, where they might have found out the information through this stream of activity. They know they can't necessarily use that to get a warrant or in your court case. They just kind of tip the DEA or somebody else and say, hey, you might want to stop this car going down this highway at this time. So you have no idea why they knew that your car was going down that highway at this time, because you have no idea that this is where they got the information. You just knew about the traffic stop. Why is that significant? And then I'm going to leave it here. It's significant because at that point, not only do you not know that the information about you is collected on a lesser than a Fourth Amendment warrant standard, you also don't know, so that's a Fourth Amendment problem, a protection against unreasonable search and seizure. You also don't know when you go to trial that they've collected all this information. So whatever you're being charged with, maybe there's somewhere in all that information they gather, there's exculpatory information. But because you have no notice, you don't know to look for it. It's a Fifth Amendment, it's a due process problem. There's a Sixth Amendment problem, right? Your right to zealous representation by your attorney might have their information being tracked, and your private was supposed to be privileged communications under some of these programs. So there's a number of ways in which what looks like just broad surveillance programs where you're just talking about privacy generally have very real and very detrimental impacts on people's constitutional rights, and the First Amendment violations, I think, are probably much more obvious to this crowd, so I won't sort of get into those. But I just wanted to touch on some of those areas where we've seen some positive progress, but there's huge gaps in terms of the way these programs, and even the courts who don't fully comprehend all this, are able to deal with how this impacts people when it comes to a more concrete example of what happens in a criminal trial and the defendant's rights.
Thank you very much. So next I want to ask Harvey the same question. So from your perspective, things gotten worse, the same, or better?
Well, first, thanks, Robert, for putting me on the panel with such a elegant group of other speakers. I guess the first thing I want to know is how many people in the room can write an algorithm? Raise your hand. So you're what we call the value added in this group. And he's the dangerous person in what I call the geek wonk bridge. From my perspective, the issue is we're at a point in time in which we're having what one can refer to as a Silicon Valley approach to these issues and a Washington approach. And we're at the cusp of that dialogue. And that dialogue was, I think, sparked in large part by the Snowden and the Manning revelations in a variety of ways. And the other aspect of the debate is the attacks on Sony and most recently on OPM. So how many of you received a letter saying that your documents held by the federal government have now been exposed, and we don't know where they particularly are, though there was currently a report that they're appearing some on the dark net for sale. So those are for me, the bookends of this sort of issue that we're confronting. And what's turning on, Jumana mentioned the Fourth Amendment. So I always read the Fourth Amendment when I'm a former dean of a law school. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. So there's a great deal of debate going on what's in effect in the digital age. And the 9 justices are trying to construe this particular Fourth Amendment given historic doctrine and technology. And it's against, quote, unreasonable searches and seizures. So there's an extraordinary amount of debate about what is reasonable and what is unreasonable. And as you can imagine, different factions come to the notion of defining what's reasonable or unreasonable in a variety of different approaches as to how they understand what privacy means. And then it shall not be later, and no warrants shall be issued but upon probable cause supported by an oath and affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So what the court has done is they started to focus on these elements as to what specificity does one understand that you're going to exercise your right. And basically it's to take evidence that has been, quote, put in that has not been under the framework of the Fourth Amendment. So I say these are actually speed bumps. If you look at what's happening is, Jim had mentioned, we're focusing on what we call the third party doctrine. What is your expectation of privacy for all of the documentation you have given up when you interact with the internet? So we in America I used to say when I've worn many hats in my life, when I was in the prosecutorial side, I used to say I'm a subpoena away from gathering all the information that Google has on you. And the private sector is the great gatherer of information, much more so than the government. It's the private sector and the major corporate entities where the data is being stored. And the question is, how do you get at that data? What is the appropriate legal framework? And then what is going to be the way we use that data? So that's why the room across the way has become an issue, and I know you'll probably talk about it too in the next round, is data at rest, is it encrypted or not? And then who has access to that encryption? And at this point, Silicon Valley's position is, if I would characterize it, we want to be in a position in which we the purveyors in the private sector, will not have access to that data. And the government's position is, we need, when we have probable cause and go through the legal framework, the government says they want access to that data. And they believe they've passed a legitimate legal framework. And the problem is, everyone's legal framework, whether you're Russia or China, may not be exactly the same. We believe in court orders. So when you say, is it better or worse? What's really happening is the conversation is starting to focus narrowly on what is gonna be appropriate Fourth Amendment analysis for the government as to what's reasonable. And two, whether or not technology, the gentleman sitting over there, will be able to write algorithms for encryption, which will result in no one, and that will be both positive and negative. Because it will be very positive if you're in Russia or China and you're a political dissident. You will very much want to be able to do that so that you will increase and maintain your anonymity. And if you're on the dark net or the dark net and you're a criminal or you are participating in terrorist or things of that nature, you'll be happy too, because you're gonna not be able to have anyone, when the government says, here's my warrant, you're gonna say, take my stuff, because no one's gonna be able to get on to what it is. That's where the debate is, and that's usually the tension that we're confronting. And that's where I see this year has put into focus in a very dramatic way that tension that is gonna be with us for a while as both the courts figure out what they wanna do and Silicon Valley figures out how it's gonna be writing new algorithms vis-a-vis protecting the data. That's how I summarize it. Sir.
Please.
So my name is Christian Dawson, and he gave a little bit of Robert gave a little bit about my bio, and I thank each panelist for giving their perspective. Harvey, I want to challenge one thing, and that's that especially when it comes to the internet infrastructure part of private industry, which I represent, we're actually seeing that being very dispersed and not just in Silicon Valley. We are seeing that kind of innovation going all across. It's global, but all across the country. And the types of companies that are doing the kind of work that are changing the environment, and just the way you described, aren't just centered in that one region, they're everywhere. That couldn't be more true than it is in the internet infrastructure space. I run a web hosting company. It is called Servint. I've been there for almost 16 years. And so I've been dealing with government subpoenas, and I've been working with companies doing all sorts of things on the internet, doing innovative things, doing disruptive things. I've been doing it for 15, 16 years. And it is in that capacity that I realized with a colleague of mine who helped found the I2 Coalition that we needed a voice in order to protect the companies that provide the infrastructure to the internet. We needed it because what we were doing, what we were providing to the world, this platform, in order to do fantastic things, it was a noble profession. It was doing something good for the world. But the only time that people even knew we existed was when they said, "Who are those guys that aren't doing enough about child pornography, or enough about piracy, or about letting the government find out what the terrorists are talking about?" We've been on the front lines fighting those battles, trying to figure out what those lines are for the past couple of decades, and we've been trying to build a singular voice for that industry in doing so. In taking a look at what's become increasingly important for our industry, Kevin did a very good job of summarizing the types of legislative things that we have been taking a look at. We've become more and more interested in human rights related issues because our consumers, our users are demanding it. And if I had to pick whether things have gotten better or things have gotten worse, I would say that I would agree with Kevin that things have gotten better, but my real answer is that we're on the bubble. For me, it comes down to a consumer confidence issue. And no matter whether we've made some progress when it comes to certain legislative actions, they are small steps towards an ultimate goal of restoring the credibility that we had before and restoring the feeling that people used to have that things were a little bit more safe and a little bit more secure and a little more private than they realized that they actually were. And now it's our responsibility to figure out how to continue that path. If the USA Freedom Act is our only bite at the apple of surveillance reform, that's not going to satisfy a lot of people, and we're going to end up eroding that credibility. If we can't make the strides that we've been talking about with protecting encryption and making it more usable and more readily available, we are not going to further the steps that we've taken this year in increasing consumer confidence. our consumers, I say it like it's a commercial thing, but really there are people that online that are doing amazing things. Every time that something, progress happens in the world, it happens because people are doing something disruptive or saying something disruptive. The things that happen on the internet that lead to positive, moving the world forward, have been curtailed because of surveillance, because of those actions, either because of direct surveillance or because of the chilling effect. And I don't think the chilling effect has been curtailed as much as we've wanted it to be with all the progress that we've made. And that's why I think that we're on the bubble. These can look like the first steps down a path of recovery, or these can be little things that we do on the way downhill, and it all depends on what we do next.
Thank you, Kristen. Just a couple of comments. I think, Jumana, some of your comments actually made me shiver in regards to how technologies not only of surveillance but also big data and cloud computing are actually really at the availability of the state, and those like yourselves and others that are trying to protect and give the same access and the same type of protections that everyone's always envisioned people have, how there's this parallel system of collecting evidence that folks don't know about. Can you kind of give us a specific case where that maybe has come up, where had that information been there, or where it's been revealed that, in fact, there was some extra information that would have helped? So that would be helpful to kind of personalize it a bit. And so that's kind of one question. And the second is, can it be reversed? So if that's the trend in one direction, I'll maybe have you, Kevin, and Harvey. It's just that, sure, if we want, so I'll start with that, and then kind of a follow-up question in regards to, how, knowing that on one hand, over the last year things have gotten better, but the technology is also advancing, and it's in a way who has the best ability to use the technology, to keep it an even keel on both sides. And so just curious in terms of, a case, and two, what's the biggest thing that you could use to try to level the playing field?
I'd love to give you specific cases. I can't really. There's very few cases where people have gotten notice. There was one case where the government has given notice that they have collected the person's information under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, and it was the one they used to justify the collection. That is now, that question is sort of on appeal as to whether or not that, that should disrupt their case. There is a small handful of cases of, Section 702 collection where people have gotten notice. There have been, though, people from the government on record essentially saying, this is we hold the information already. This is not in violation of someone's Fourth Amendment rights. It's no different than, other types of law enforcement. So they've essentially made the case for using it this way. But so I think the biggest remedy, frankly, is notice. That if this is where the information's coming from, that the defense counsel needs to know that this is where the information is coming from. It's very basic, but it's also very difficult to come by. We've even seen cases when it comes to surveillance technologies, which also implicates people's privacy rights. I think if anyone's heard of a Stingray, a couple of people also know the cell site simulators. What they are is basically, it's technology that the government can use that can be small, like the size of a suitcase, where they can walk through and collect, and it acts like a cell phone tower. So basically, if I'm calling someone on my phone and it routes to whatever tower is over there, it's getting diverted first and going through this government machine and then to the tower. But it's not just my phone call, which they might be looking for. It's anybody in this area. So it could be thousands, 10,000 people at the same time. And they also have a version of them, dirt boxes, or they have other names that can be used in planes and collect even more. So basically this technology that can sweep up everybody's phone call, because they might be trying to monitor mine or a couple of others, by acting as a cell tower. A couple of cases where they've been sort of discovered and people have challenged it in court, they have non-disclosure agreements. What that means is when they get to court and defense counsel has a motion, they're saying, we need information on this technology, we need information on how this works, they go silent. And they say, well, we can't provide you with that. We have a non-disclosure agreement with the company, which sounds ludicrous. And what has ended up happening in the cases that have come through is, rather than a remedy, they cut a very sweet plea deal, which any defense counsel would be stupid not to take. and where someone may have been up for years and years of prison time, suddenly they're getting 6 months of probation, and that's the way they're keeping it quiet. I think that the difficult part again is all the cases where you don't know it's happening. And so I think notice is one of the biggest pieces of this, but I think the other thing that I just want to put out there, because I mean, to be clear, some of these cases that have gone through the courts and even to the Supreme Court are not cases of, because I know people always frame this in terms of the collection of innocent people's information. Ultimately, that's not where rights get protected, and that's not what they're there for. The restrictions aren't put in place because innocent people might have their phone records put somewhere. The restrictions are put in place because if the government is going to go to that ultimate sanction of depriving someone of their liberty or even their life, they actually have to have a basis for doing it. They can't just the idea was that they can't just kind of rummage through, see what they could find to put a case together against somebody, that they need to have specific facts, particularity. And frankly, on the Fourth Amendment question, yes, there's all the things he read. There's unreasonable, what is your effect? Is it have particularity? But there's nothing in there that actually requires them to be able to find what they're looking for. And I think that goes to the encryption question. And so even if it's not encrypted, but I just came up with a very clever code that just me and this other person understand, and that's all they found, that's all they found. If they came to search my house and whatever it was they're looking for, I was just really good at hiding, and they never found it, they never found it. And so I think it's hard because this is not, people keep trying to make comparisons. Is it like a safe? Is it like this? Is this like a file cabinet? Is this like what is this like? And I think what we need to understand is it's not like necessarily the phone records from the 70s or something. So we have to sort of reimagine this in the context of how it's being used and what it's doing. And also the understanding when it comes to the chilling effect. We know that these programs have been used not just to disrupt terrorist plots. And when I say that, I always, I feel like there's an asterisk for me after that because frankly, when you talk about free speech rights are not just about being able to speak about nice things. They're about being able to speak about very offensive things. Mm-hmm. And I think that is changing when it comes with this countering violent extremism narrative and the fact that Tarek Mahana was convicted of material support for terrorism, not for a plot, not for making a plan, not for transferring money, but for translating materials for a terrorist organization and putting them online. People in this country are supposed to be allowed to engage in offensive speech, right? Just not dangerous speech. I can't go to the movie theater and cry fire. I can't go to the airport and say, I have a bomb. That's going to create chaos. But should I be able to go online and say, the U.S. sucks and everything you do is bad and, whatever I want to say? Theoretically, yes. Realistically, you might end up in jail for 17 years. And so that's where some of these things are getting problematic in terms of what you call terrorism prosecution, but they're also using these same authorities to monitor peace groups, to monitor environmental groups, animal rights groups. There's a lot of activity that is not, I think, what people conceive of when we're always talking about terrorism. That is not ISIS chopping off heads or burning people alive. They do horrible things. That's not the point that I'm trying to make, right? It's about activity that falls far short of anything that is discussed. But the discussion always goes to the very emotional cases, and it doesn't acknowledge the fact that this is how, in fact, these things are being used. So I think, yes, notice is really critical. I think that you should, I think the other problem is this sort of shifting that has happened where, people used to get warrants, and then restrictions got loosened, and suddenly they're going to the FISA court to get the same information. It's not the same standard. It's not the same standard at all, and you don't know what's happening, and it happens in secret, and it's not. So, I think there's all these ways in which the rights have been denigrated that they can be bolstered, that the United States can still engage in whatever security they need to, without being able to sort of data mine all this information they're gathering all the time to see, what they can use against people.
So Kevin, you were talking about all the legislative and regulatory successes, I guess, over the last year that have been fought, and some are being challenged. To Jumana's point, how can we reset the paradigm? How can we reset going from using analogies of the past to basically recognizing we're in a technology age, and we should be using current paradigms instead? Is that feasible? Is that possible?
I tend to think analogies are helpful. Analogizing our email to our telephone calls is one of the reasons why now in law enforcement cases, warrants are required if they want to seize it from our cloud provider. The short answer is I don't think we can reverse the trend that we are continuing to rely on more and more services that in turn rely on or generate enormous amounts of data. I don't think there's a technical solution to that. We could encrypt everything. There would still be an enormous amount of revealing metadata that we can't encrypt. But we're also not going to encrypt everything because there are a whole lot of services and therefore business models that rely on unencrypted data, or rather the provider having access to the data, whether it's filtering for spam or giving you the ability to search in the cloud, or advertising based on the content of your email so that it's free. So the data is going to be there. There's going to be more of it every day as basically the internet turns into the world. As we have this Internet of Things, and all of the problems we look at now as internet privacy problems are going to become the problems of the privacy problems of the world, of our refrigerator, of our toilet, of our car. So we can't reverse it technically. The only answer, and I think an appropriate answer for this community, is the rule of law. And I do think that we have made some progress on that score. We have, for example, established that in criminal cases, warrants are required for the content of our communications, even if they're stored in the cloud. We are making some progress on, in terms of location tracking and requiring and demonstrating that the Fourth Amendment applies to at least some location tracking or location tracking data. And with the example of the USA Freedom Act, there's an example where, based on a whistleblower revealing a program that went far beyond what the Congress thought it had authorized, the Congress came in and said, we're going to deauthorize that now. However, it's very hard when the infrastructure is already in place. So for example, if you're talking about the surveillance of the upstream, quote unquote, surveillance that's happening on the network, on the backbone here in the US, that's basically been happening for over a decade now, and has been happening under congressional statutory authorization since 2008. It's going to be very hard to roll that back, although that's certainly going to be our mission up through 2017 when that law comes up for renewal. But speaking much more broadly, and to come back to a point that's been made several times already, the real issue is this thing called the third-party records doctrine, whereby, based on some cases from the 70s, the basic understanding of the Fourth Amendment right now is that information you expose to another party, you don't have a Fourth Amendment interest in it if it's acquired from that party. But we live in an age where everything about us is being exposed to some third party that's providing us a digital service. And that's only going to increase in the future. And so if we can't win that foundational, legal, and ultimately philosophical battle about how far our privacy rights should extend to data that we're sharing with other people in order to obtain a service, we're in deep trouble. That said, there are a few cases in the US Supreme Court that have indicated some willingness of the court to reconsider or limit that doctrine in the wake of new digital services. So I actually see some real hope on that score. But then again, the technology moves much faster than, the technology evolves much faster than the legal doctrine does, and we may find ourselves far ahead of what protections the court can give us. And in fact, I think we're kind of already there.
So I have a question related to this for you, Christian, and then Harvey. But Christian, you're both in terms of you run a company that holds third-party data.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you work with similar organizations or companies as well that do that. So I think the question I have for you is, first, how onerous is it to be serviced? Because everyone's coming to, law enforcement, different government agencies are coming to you, and so are they compensating you when they want access? Do you have to provide it? Some may know, but I'm just curious in terms of what the cost financially is, and for the organization it might seem prohibitive because and two, what are you and kind of your members doing to push back against these type of requests?
So to answer the cost question, generally you don't get compensated for your time. If somebody has a court order, you're going to process the court order, and that's just going to be in the course of doing business. You're going to get that taken care of. Now, if there's something that causes them to legally have a right to equipment that you own, you can certainly get compensation for that, but that's different. When it comes to how to quantify the amount of time that it takes to work with law enforcement, a lot of it comes down to, well, my answer there is that it varies wildly. There are lots of different types of law enforcement agencies, from federal agencies to lots of local jurisdictions, and there is a huge gulf in knowledge and a gulf in the different types of not only warrant or subpoena that you receive and the quality of them, but the data included therein. Sometimes, of course, you get brought requests that aren't warrant-based or subpoena-based, and that's something that you have to engage them on as well, and talk them through a process and explain to them what data needs to be required, and that can sometimes be extremely onerous and go back and forth for a long, long time. I have 2 people working full-time on dealing with law enforcement and abuse requests. I would say that probably because the internet things break, there are more abuse requests than law enforcement requests, but a law enforcement request can be extremely easy to deal with or extremely lengthy and difficult to deal with, depending on a number of factors, and education could certainly help there. As far as what we are doing to try to address this issue, I'm going to come back to education after I talk about what providers like us are doing to push back on law enforcement requests.